Yeah, there I am after a big long walk, because 3 days ago I decided not to put winter tyres on my car. Then it snowed. And that wouldn't have been so bad, except that the next day I spent the time exclusively on my backside rolling around a Bulgarian mountain with a snowboard attached to my feet. Then I came home and tried to make this video yesterday, which, well, it didn't go very well at all. I'm really lost. As a consequence, I had to walk here, and I can't really walk at the moment. So that was fun. I can't really see either. Better, even though I probably look ridiculous. Anyway, this video is sponsored by Lumix, who make all my cameras and lenses. That makes it sound like they make them just for me. That's absolutely not the case. Sadly, they make them for other people as well. It would be awesome if they made them just for me, but they don't. They're available in shops. And there's a good chance that you're wondering why this is the third biggest beginner mistake that I'm going to talk about. And it's because I've done videos on the biggest mistake and the second biggest mistake already, and I'll link those in the description. But this video, the third biggest beginner mistake, is all about overexposure. Now today is a bit of a strange day to do this video, because if you've shot, particularly with automatic modes on your camera, in snowy conditions, you'll have noticed that typically your images come out underexposed, and that's because your camera looks at a scene like this, sees all the white and goes, oh, flipping out, there's so much white there, it's really, really bright. I don't want to lose any of the detail in most of the image, so I'm going to underexpose to make sure I capture that detail. And what that means is you get lots of detail in the snow that you don't necessarily want or need, and everything else is just black, like the trees and the houses and whatever else is in the image, because they're not anywhere near as bright as the snow. Yeah. Just thought I should check the exposure. The irony of ranting about exposure if I get it wrong in the video. So yeah, for the 364 days a year here in the UK where everywhere isn't filled with snow, I'd suggest that you'd really want to be overexposing your shots, because you're going to be risking clipping your highlights, in other words losing all the detail in the highlights. And as I said, you don't often want lots of detail in snow, but in clouds and other bright things you want detail, and if you overexpose your shots you're risking losing that detail. And typically, in my experience, somebody in the comments cleverer than me might be able to explain why, but typically I find that people are much more forgiving of really dark shadows than they are of highlights that are clipped or too bright. I don't know why that is. I don't know if that's just how the eye sees things, and the eye is used to kind of dark shadows more than it is blown out details in the sky, or whether it's just unnatural. I don't know why that is, but yeah, in my experience I find that people don't mind images with pure black in a lot of instances, where if you have missing detail in the sky, for instance, they'll not like that. Now, clipping your highlights is really infuriating for two reasons. The first is that there's not a whole lot that you can do about it in post. So if you're missing detail in the highlights of your images, if your camera has only captured pure white in parts of your images, then you're not going to be able to recover any detail. And secondly, the reason it's annoying is because modern cameras have lots of different functions and features. Functions and features. Modern cameras have lots of different ways of aiding you in not clipping your highlights, and today I'm going to go through some of those. Also, before I start, I should probably explain that, like everything in photography, there is no hard and fast rule, and there are plenty of times when I haven't minded or I've intended to clip my highlights. For example, this photo that I shot in Iceland a few months ago, this image is all about contrast. It's all about the brightest highlights in the foam in the water, and it's all about the darkest shadows in the black sand of the beach. And if it didn't have those, the image wouldn't really work. It wouldn't be contrasty, and the image is all about contrast. So basically, in an image like that, it's important to clip your highlights and to lose detail in the shadows as well. But most of the time, when you've got highlights in an image such as clouds, you're going to be wanting to capture detail in those. For example, in this photo that I got in Italy a few weeks before the Iceland one, this is all about the detail in the clouds. And if I'd lost that detail in the clouds, if I'd overexposed the image, then it would have been, well, it would have just looked horrible. So in that instance, it was really important that I didn't clip the highlights, and therefore I used some of the features that I'm going to talk about right now. So without further ado, and me waffling on continuously forever and ever because I can't feel my toes, histogram is the first thing I'm going to talk about. So in lots of modern mirrorless cameras, you can have a histogram appear on your EVF or on your monitor. I think in DSLRs as well, in live view, some of the cameras might have a histogram feature available too. It's been a while since I've used a DSLR. But basically, if you don't know what a histogram is, if you've never used one before, it shows you at the tonal range in your image. So if your image is really dark, then you'll get a big spike towards the left of the histogram. And if your image has got lots and lots of highlights, you'll get a big spike on the right. And if you've got tones kind of in the middle, you'll get a spike in the middle. And obviously the bigger the spread of the spike, the more tones you have in your image. That's a very simplistic description, but that's, in essence, that's what it is. So basically, if you've got a big spike touching one of the sides of your histogram, then it might be worth adjusting your exposure so that that isn't the case, because if that is the case, then there's a chance that you're losing detail either in the shadows or in the highlights, depending what side the spike's on. So yeah, that could be quite a handy tool to check your exposure. Another tool that I quite like to use is called the zebra tool. I don't know if it's a tool or a feature or a function or a pattern. Zebra pattern, or if you're in America, zebra. And basically what this does is it shows a pattern in areas of your image where you've got kind of bright spots, or if you're in danger of clipping those parts of the image. Now you can set your zebra pattern to show when you've got like 80% white in that area of photo, 85, 90, 95, 100. So you can basically choose the pattern to show when you're at risk of clipping your highlights or when you're definitely going to clip your highlights. And yeah, I find that a very useful feature. I even have that set up on my drone because my drone's sensor is a hell of a lot less capable than the sensor in this. And therefore I need to be really careful with the highlights on the drone because the dynamic range on the drone, my Mavic Air, is, well, it's not as good as this. Now if your camera doesn't have those features, it may well have a feature where you can choose to meter based on the highlights, which basically means the camera will look at a scene and it'll check out the highlights and make sure that it exposes for those highlights, which on a day like today wouldn't really work because, I mean, most of the image wherever you look would be a highlight, and therefore it would expose for those highlights and just make everything else pretty much black. But it can be useful in lower contrast situations to make sure that your brightest parts are not going to clip and you're still going to retain detail in those places. The fourth thing, the fourth tip, feature, function, whatever we're calling these, is bracketing. Now I use bracketing all the time, particularly on days like this with really high contrast, because it just means I've got more of a chance of capturing all the detail that I want to capture regardless of how bright it is. So I have a button set up on my G9, or a switch really, and if I flick it then my bracketing comes on, all of which means that when I go to take a photo I'll actually take 3 photos. There'll be one that's slightly underexposed, one that's the right exposure, and one that's slightly overexposed. Now you can set these up in lots of different increments. You can set it up to take 7, 9, 5 different photos at one stop, half a stop, third of a stop, whatever it might be. But bracketing is a tool that I find really useful because then I can go and choose to put those images together in post if I want to, or I can get home and select the best exposure for what I'm going for. So yeah, I use bracketing a lot. And finally, if your camera doesn't have bracketing, or for some reason you don't want to use it, perhaps you don't want to use up all the storage, or you're shooting really fast moving subjects, or maybe you've just got a point and shoot, or you're just using a phone to take your photos, what I would do is just slightly overexpose. In scenes like this, which are really high contrast, because as I said at the start, people seem much more willing to forgive really dark shadows than they do highlights that are blown out, and I still don't know why that is. And also typically if I capture all the detail in the highlights, then I'm not all that averse a lot of the time to pulling up the shadows in post, even if that introduces some noise into the image, because it just means that I have all the detail that I want and it becomes up to me whether or not I want some noise in the image, or I want a clean image with less detail in the shadows. So yeah, to sum up, most of the time you want to avoid overexposing your photos, and given that there are so many aids on your camera to help you do so, I put it down as a beginner mistake if you're unintentionally blowing your highlights when you don't mean to, which is what I mean by unintentional.